name's Craig Highfield. I am the director of the forest programs for the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and you are here for the first of a 4-part series for the Delaware Tree Stewards. So if you're here, I'm hoping you have an interest in trees, and I hope you have an interest in learning all about them, how to properly plant them and take care of them. So just to kind of give you some background on this. So this is the Delaware Tree Stewards program. We're kind of offering this in coordination with a Maryland Tree Stewards program. So right across the border there, the Mason-Dixon, you have Marylanders who are kind of doing the same thing. So we kind of started this effort at the Alliance in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, Delaware Forest Service, and the Maryland Forest Service on a U.S. Forest Service grant. And really the idea, hopefully you had an opportunity to look at the introductory video. It's like 8 minutes long. It kind of explains why we're trying to do this, but we're actually want to try to increase urban tree canopy throughout the Chesapeake watershed. But, you know we're limited supply of manpower. So our idea is really to find those who are really interested in helping us, really interested in putting trees in the ground within their own communities. We're kind of building the army to kind of help do this. So that's why we're very grateful for you all in attending this. But, a brief word from our sponsors, because this would not happen if it wasn't for Delaware Forest Service. So I'm going to turn it over to them right now for the next slide.
Thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. My name is Taryn Davidson. I'm the Urban Forester and Outreach Coordinator with the Delaware Forest Service. I also have here with us Keisha Bronskill, and she is our Urban and Community Forestry Coordinator. So I'm just going to give you a little bit background about the Forest Service and what we do. So our Forest Service, next slide, please, Craig. Our Forest Service is made up of 4 sections. We have fire, stewardship, forest health, and urban and community forestry. And we're all housed in the Department of Ag with 2 different outreach stations, basically. One in Redden, we have a Redden State Forest in Georgetown, and then we have Blackbird State Forest in Smyrna. Next slide.
Hold on here. Here we go.
Thank you. So our urban program offers educational, financial, and technical assistance to homeowners, communities, and municipalities. So we help with tree planting events. We will go to sick tree calls. So if you have a tree you're concerned about on your property, we'll come take a look at it. We do species placement and placement recommendations and species recommendations. We perform educational assistance to communities and schools. And then we have our annual grant program open to homeowners, communities, and municipalities as well. So our goal with Tree Stewards is to educate, prepare, and assist individuals to be able to lead planting events in their community. And this training benefits our program as it allows us to expand our network of trained individuals. So as trained tree stewards, you will be able to assist other communities with their planting projects, lead planting projects in your community, and assist us with volunteer events as well. So I'm really happy to see you all here, and I'm looking forward to this training series and see you all become certified tree stewards. Back to you, Craig.
All right, thank you. We really do appreciate Delaware Forest Service. They actually helped us lead this grant when getting it from the Forest Service several years ago. So they were our lead applicant on that, and we've done wonderful things with this funding. So this is the Tree Stewards program. So it's going to be broken down into 4 webinar sessions that we're going to crank out in 2 weeks, which is normally we do 1 a week, but we're going to do this quickly, get this information to you. And there's going to be a hands-on in-person 5th session that'll be announced later. And maybe Taryn or Keisha can talk about that as we get through some of these sessions. So kind of how we're breaking it down. Today, we're going to talk about Tree and Soil Biology 101. Just kind of give you the basics of how trees grow, how they interact with the soil, so you can understand what's happening kind of for that long haul with those trees. Then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about site assessment and tree selection. And what that means is just, going out into an area you want to plant trees and trying to find the proper place to plant the right tree. So matching kind of that site condition with the tree that's going to really thrive in those conditions. So we'll talk all about that on Wednesday. And then we're going to talk about the actual tree planting and tree care practices. So, the proper way to plant and kind of take care of a tree will be on session number 3. Just some tips and tricks to do that. And then the last session next Wednesday will be kind of developing planting plans. So you have these skills. How do you put it together to plan a project within your own community? And then also, what are the organizations and resources out there that can help you succeed in all this? And so that'll be on the Wednesday or next Wednesday. All of these sessions are going to be recorded when we're done today. And we're going to send out the links for it. We'll put it up on our YouTube channel. And you can listen to them at any time. And I'd be happy to share the slides as well if you get tired of hearing my voice. All right, so for this course, we kind of base it on, 2 resources that it's kind of the curriculum for the course, because, essentially it's going to be 4 hours of training, but there's a wealth of stuff out there that will help you along. So I kind of base this course on 2 free to access resources that I think are quite excellent from the U.S. Forest Service. One is the Urban Watershed Forestry Manual, Part 3. It's important. The Part 3 is the Urban Tree Planting Guide, because there is a Part 1 and a Part 2, but they're more for planners and local government planners. So that's available free online. So you just got to Google that, Urban Watershed Forestry Manual Part 3, and you'll get that. Also, the Tree Owners Manual. That's a great one as well. And those are both free as PDFs online. So today, we're going to be talking about the tree and soil biology. So kind of taking you back to your biology days. Why are we going to do this? Well, we're just going to figure out how trees work and how they grow. Now, I'll admit, a lot of this stuff maybe that you're thinking about, you don't need this information to be able to plant a tree properly in the ground. But the idea is, planting trees, you're in it for the long haul. They don't grow that fast. It takes a while for them to grow. So I think it's really important to understand what's happening as you plant a tree. How is that tree growing? How is it responding to the environment? So I admit, this first session, it's with information that's a little bit more dense than the other sessions, but I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think you can handle it. So feel free to ask questions. Some of them I'll address during this presentation, and we'll have a section at the end to address questions as well. But think about it. So that, this is a large white oak tree. Why does this tree look like this? It's low growing, very, very wide. And in a different context in a forest, the tree on the right, why does it look like that? Well, it always, what these trees need, how they're growing within their environment. Obviously, the first one was an open grown tree, and this one is within a forest. So trees are going to behave differently depending where they're actually planted. So let's get on to what is a tree? What separates a tree from grass or a bamboo or something like that? So kind of the definition of a tree has these 4 characteristics, all 4 of these. They're long-lived perennial plants. They have woody tissue. They have both primary and secondary growth. And we're going to go over all this stuff. And they're compartmentalizing organisms. And I'm going to talk about each of these things to kind of explain what that means. And so when we're talking about trees, we're also really talking about woody shrubs as well, because that's something you could be planting as well. We plant them a lot, shrubs as well as trees within our projects. So kind of we're going to refer to a lot of this stuff. So it's kind of the simple diagram. What we're going to be talking about are, the roots of the trees. And then we're going to talk about the stem or the trunk of the trees, branches, twigs, and leaves. So if I reference crown, what I'm kind of referencing are the twigs, branches, and the leaves. And then the trunk is often the stem. I might refer to it as the stem of the tree. So it's kind of that main initial branch of that tree. And then obviously roots are roots. You all know that. So types of trees. So we can really break down trees into 2 different categories. We have angiosperms. So some trees are angiosperms, and then some trees are gymnosperms. So all that simply means is it's a way of kind of dividing our trees based on how they're reproducing. So an angiosperm, it produces its seed within a fruit, within an ovary on that tree. So it is a flowering plant. Not all angiosperms are trees, but we have angiosperms. They're usually our deciduous trees. So those are the trees that are going to drop their leaves annually, as we get into fall. They're also like the broadleaf trees. You might hear them called broadleaf or hardwood trees. Those are all angiosperms. They're producing a fruit that has a seed within it. Things like oaks and maples and cherries. We also have, growing in Delaware, gymnosperms. So these are a type of gymnosperm would be a conifer. And so these are producing cones. It's produced a naked seed. That's where you get gymnosperm from. So it's a seed within a cone. It's not within a fruit, within that flower. So we have those like loblolly pine would be an example of a conifer or a gymnosperm. They're called softwoods or evergreens, pines, spruces, firs, cedars. Those are all types of gymnosperms. Both of them grow in Delaware. They grow extremely well in Delaware, but this is how we can start to break down different types of trees. There's all those roll breakers though, because also growing in Delaware, we do have gymnosperms like the bald cypress that actually drops its needles every autumn. So they're deciduous, but they're a gymnosperm, but they do produce that cone. And then there's the troublemaker American holly, and it's an angiosperm, so it's a flowering tree that produces that fruit, but they're evergreen, so they drop their leaves throughout the year, not just annually as we get into autumn. And that's the same for any conifer. It's going to drop the needles, but it's going to happen throughout the year. It's not all going to be at once. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how trees grow. So just like any organism, the way we grow is based on the interactions of our hormones. So trees are organisms. So they have hormones that really dictate how they grow. So those hormones are influenced by environmental triggers. Okay, it kind of shows which hormone is going to take over that tree for a while. So triggers like you say the spring, when you get longer days and you get warmer soils and more rain. So those are environmental triggers that are going to cause certain hormones to do things with that tree. So especially in our broadleaf trees, you have bud break. Okay, so there'll be a hormone that causes that. Or in the autumn, when the leaves start to change because of shorter daylight hours, there's hormones that affect that. So everything that a tree is doing, it's affected by the hormones within the tree. For instance, breaking of the buds in the spring. Gibberellins is a hormone within the tree that kind of takes over, that helps the tree break bud at that certain time when it's warmer weather, it's longer days, more moisture in the soil. It kind of triggers that. Or in autumn, things like auxin, which is a growth hormone. When the days are shorter, the auxin within that tree are interacting to make the tree realize it needs to start breaking down its chlorophyll and pulling its resources back in for storage. So the hormones are affecting how the tree's growing. So like I said, what makes a tree, it has primary growth and secondary growth. Okay, that's what makes it a tree compared to a grass. Okay, so primary growth, and we're going to break down each one of these to kind of explain how that tree is growing. So primary growth is the elongation or the lengthening of those twigs, of those stems. So if you look here with the blue, so every year that tree is going to grow longer, going to grow taller, but it does it at the end of the twigs. Secondary growth is the lateral growth. Okay, that's the branches getting wider. It's the lateral growth widening, the trunk thickening. So this all occurs within that tree, not over, but in the special area called meristems. Okay, a meristem is simply cells that produce other cells. So if you think of, in mammals, humans, the stem cells, in animals that we have stem cells, they're undifferentiated cells. So they're cells that are producing the cells that are needed for the various organs within a tree, the leaves, the twigs, the barks, the flowers, the roots. So they're going to produce what the tree needs in order to grow. So they only occur in certain areas of that tree. So that primary growth, the elongation of the stems and the twigs, that happens in the apical meristem. Now, it's not that important that you remember all these terms, but just understand where the trees are growing, how they're growing. Okay, so the meristems, those special cells, exist at the end of the buds and at the end of the roots. So that's how the tree are getting longer. Okay, every year, the roots get a little bit longer, the buds get a little bit longer, or the twigs get a little bit longer, and that's that growth. That's how that tree is filling up. That's how that crown is getting bigger. There's also secondary growth, and that happens in the meristem called the cambium layer. Okay, and that's kind of the vascular system of the tree. It's where the sap goes up and down, water's up and down. It's in the cambium, and we're going to go through each one of those to kind of see that. I'll explain that a little bit more. So if you think about this tree right here, this mature southern red oak, it's, every year the stems at the end of these branches are getting longer. Okay, they're shooting out their year's growth, but why they're doing it, that's that primary growth. The secondary growth is all that support, so that the stems get a little bit thicker throughout that growing season to support all that weight from that crown. So you have primary growth and secondary growth happening at the same time. Okay, so let's go a little bit more into the primary growth, the elongation. So I want you to kind of look at, this twig right here, because this is where it's happening. Where the meristems are, where that growing tissue is producing those cells, are at the end. These are called the buds right here. So that's where they're located right here. And these lateral buds are located right here. That's what's going to be growing. Those are where those cells are going to produce more stems, flowers. Everything that tree needs for the next year is located right here in these buds, ready to go, produced by those meristems. So if you look at this drawing here, this terminal bud right here, the previous season, that growing season, was down here at this girdle scar. And you can actually see that if you pull down a twig, you can actually see where the bud grew from last year. It leaves a little bit of scar. So within that year, that tree was ready to go. In that growing season, it put on all of that growth right here. Okay, it put on more stem. It put on these side lateral buds, made these lenticels. Where the leaf scar was, it produced leaves. But that's that growth for that year. Next year, this area doesn't grow anymore. It's just at the end. So this bud will take off and make more length. And this lateral branches will do the same thing. It'll start to grow out that way. So before I move on, so this terminal bud is very powerful. It controls the growth of these twigs, the rest of the twig. It could let this lateral branch grow, or it could suppress it and make it go dormant. And so it doesn't grow. It controls that tree, essentially. So every branch has something that's controlling. So take a look at this. All of the energy, the meristems, are up in these terminal buds up here. It's controlling the rest. The next year, this is going to grow longer. This down here puts on the secondary growth. It gets wider. It's not getting any longer down here. It's just getting wider to support the weight up here. And this is kind of a cool picture. You can kind of see where the leaves from last year are. They leave a nice little scar here. These are the lateral buds. So this has the energy to be, everything is going to be up here. It's going to produce the flowers and the seeds. All that information is ready to go. These are lenticels. So these are little cork structures that help with the exchange of gas within, so carbon dioxide and oxygen from going in and out. All right. So the reason I say that's in control, and this is going to help when eventually when we talk about potential pruning of a tree, shaping a tree, especially in that built environment, is, I'll come back to this. This bud right here has control of the whole branch. Okay. So it's called apical dominance. Don't worry about that, but it controls the growth of that tree. Some trees have strong apical dominance for most of their lives. So if you think about any conifer, any pine tree or any fir tree, they have a nice long straight stem. It's because that terminal bud controls that whole tree for its life. But then you have others with weak apical dominance. And so that's why this tulip poplar looks different than this white oak, because you have a lot of these side branches, this craziness going on there, because there isn't one bud controlling them all. Okay, if you take a look at this tree, all trees, when you first plant them, I'd say not all, I'd say most of them have that strong dominance. So you plant this tree right here, see that stem, see how long it is? Nice and control. So it controls the rest of these branches because it wants to grow up, and then eventually these side branches will start to grow. Why that's important is, take a look at this tree. So this is a black gum out the side of my house, but you can see it has a nice long stem. It goes up here. This is the dominant one. It's going to keep growing up. But if you take a closer look, there's the terminal bud that died. Some killed it. I don't know what it was, but it didn't make it. So what ends up happening is another lateral branch will actually take over control, or try to assert control of that tree, and it'll start to grow up. So if you take a look at that, so it almost looks like, all right, this is going to be the dominant one up here. It's because that lateral branch turned, and it turned up to assert control of this, which is kind of wow. So when you're thinking of a tree, when you're starting to prune, and we'll get into pruning in the third session, I think, maybe it's the fourth session, I don't know. You can help shape a tree by choosing which of those branches you want to be the dominant branch. And that's really important in a built environment when you're planting trees, is eventually you're going to help the tree, you're going to help shape the tree, because you don't want it to cause problems to, you know, sidewalks, to structures, things like that. When you can help shape it for a built environment.
Hey, Craig, sorry to interrupt you. I think we can't see your cursor as you're pointing to things with it. Just
really?
No, yeah,
Oh,
I don't know
man.
why that is happening.
Oh man. All right. Well, I'll do a better job describing what I'm seeing. Well, on this tree, so if you look at this tree, this is silver maple. Something happened to the terminal bud a long time ago. And so these are those lateral branches that are kind of growing up the side, kind of competing with each other. And, you know, it's not a bad tree, but in a built environment, you know, there's a weakness here between the union of this tree. So maybe a long time ago, somebody could have pruned one of those sides to make one the dominant. That's what I was saying. So sometimes those buds on the side, because they're in control, don't grow at all. But something happens to the tree, something happens to that leader. So sometimes you can have sleeping dormant buds. I shouldn't say sleeping, that's not scientific. Sometimes you have dormant buds that, because they're not kept in control, can just start growing, you know, after years. Here's a great example. Look at this black gum on the right and this tulip poplar on the left. Well, something major stressful happened to these trees. You know, they got knocked over. The roots are still connected to the ground, but there's a dormant bud right there that's come alive. And now that's kind of the main stem of that tree. Eventually that tree's going to rot, and this stem won't make it. But up here as well, that tree's still alive. Those dormant buds are free to grow. And that's really important. So this is an ash tree. And if you know anything about ash, well, we don't really have them anymore. The Emerald Ash Borer has taken out many. This is an ash tree that was killed by a borer. The owners cut it down, but the roots were still intact. There's a lot of energy in those roots. They had dormant buds. And so, you know, you have regrowth coming out of the base of that tree. It's the same organism. It's just putting on more shoots that, you know, that it's free from control now. They'll compete with each other. Hopefully one survives and are able to last the Emerald Ash Borer. So really the recap on primary growth, kind of the main things. I gave you a lot of information, but the main thing really is primary growth is the elongation of the stems, and the terminal bud controls the lateral buds to a degree through apical dominance And then the meristems are just producing all those cells, but they're not located throughout the stem. They're located right at the end of the buds. That's why it's really important. That's why, like, when we plant trees and we don't protect them from deer, you know, deer love to eat those buds, but that's where that growth tissue's located, is in those meristems. That's why we always have to protect our investment there. Secondary growth. So this is kind of the lateral growth of the tree. And you guys have probably heard all about this, and you know, the rings of a tree. So this happens in the lateral growth, it's secondary growth, and it happens in a meristem. So it's a thin layer of cells called the cambium, and they're undifferentiated cells. They're just cambium. They're not root cells. They're not you know, stem cells. They're not bark cells. They're cambium, and that's located. If you just look at that diagram right there, it's a very, very thin layer of cells just under the bark, under a tissue called the phloem. So it's right there at that surface. There's also cork cambium, which produces the bark of the tree, but we're not going to get into that in this session. So you have different parts of growth here. You have the bark, then you have the phloem, the cambium, and the xylem, which is really the wood of the tree. And so we're going to kind of get into that here in a second. So this is all part of the vascular system. So you think of our vascular system, it's moving blood throughout our body. Well, you know, blood and everything with it, the oxygen and the nutrients we need to grow, the food we need, that's what is happening in a tree. You have a vascular system to move minerals, water, and food up and down a tree. And it happens in this lateral growth area. So this is another diagram of what it would look like of a tree standing up, just so you get a sense of it. You have the bark, you have the phloem, you have that cambium, which is the meristem. It's going to produce the phloem to this side, and it produces xylem to this side, which is the wood of the tree. We'll get into both of those. So it's a really thin layer of cells. So kind of the function of this, we'll talk about the xylem first before we get in the phloem, and that's the wood of the tree. So that's the part it's given the support. So what really that does, it provides really the weight of the tree. It's storing all this carbon of the tree. It supports the weight of that tree, because that tree gets bigger and the crown gets bigger. It needs to support that weight. So that's why you have that wood in there, is to support the weight of the tree. But it's also conducting water in that tree. And then, unfortunately, we don't seem to have a lot of water here in the last couple of weeks, at least not in Maryland, you know. It's taking the water from the roots, or transported up through the xylem to get into the tree. So up the xylem, out to the leaves to help things grow. So in that springtime, you know, that stuff water is being pulled in by the roots and taken up to where that growth is happening. So it's transporting water up that tree. It also stores food, the carbohydrates. We'll get into that when we talk about the leaves, but it stores, because if you think about it, when trees, you know, especially in the wintertime, when they're dormant, they're getting ready to grow. They need energy. So if they didn't have stored energy, they wouldn't be able to put their leaves out to make more energy. They wouldn't be able to grow at all, because they didn't have that sugar that was needed. And so the xylem helps store that. And then also defends against the spread of disease and decay. And we'll kind of talk about the compartmentalization in that in a second. So you may notice that, you know, the rings of a tree, you know, that happens in the xylem. And what's happening there is the ring really is formed by it's an annual ring. So it's usually that ring grows once a year. Usually in the spring, you have kind of the light colored part, because you're having rapid growth. Most of your growth is happening kind of in that springtime into the early part of summer. And then the tree starts to slow down, and the cells of that tree get a little more dense, which produces a ring, which is kind of cool. So you can kind of look at this tree and you're saying, well, I can count how old this is, because this is an annual ring. So the xylem is made up of really two parts. You have the heartwood, which is dead cells. That's just wood. That's the strongest part of that tree. So it's dead cells that are filled with resins and metabolic waste. So on this tree in particular, this is actually a Doug fir out west, but I took a picture of it just because it's so evident where the heartwood is on this tree. So that's just dead cells. The living cells of the xylem are only in the outer rings. So all that water going up that tree is only in the outer rings. It's not throughout the whole thing. The inner part is the heartwood. The outer part is what we call the sapwood. And you can actually see the resins coming out of there after this cut down tree. And it really depends on the species. Some species, it's only a couple rings that have the living cells. Some species, like this, it might be 10 rings here that are more. So that's the living part of the xylem, is the sapwood. The inner part is just dead cells. And that's why you can look at a tree that's growing perfectly fine, but might have a large hole in the side of it. You may have seen that somewhere where the heartwood rots out for some reason, but the tree's still growing because the heartwood is just dead wood. The cool thing about trees and how it puts on wood, though, it puts on wood to support that tree. So as that tree's getting bigger, you might see leaning trees a lot. It's going to actually add wood where it's needed to support the structure of that tree. It's like perfect architecture here. It's supporting that wood. As a tree leans one way, it's going to add wood where it's needed for that support. And you can see it here on this is pretty shallow soil. So a lot of times on shallow soil, a tree will buttress out. You can see on this very large oak tree, it buttressing out. So it's adding wood to the base to be able to support the weight of that tree. You can even see that on branches. A tree's going to add, the branch collar, thicker wood down here to support the weight of that branch. It's kind of remarkable how trees work that way. Within that primary growth, you also have, and you might see this, I won't go into much of this, but you have living cells called rays, that are growing in there. You can store carbohydrates here, transport water, but most of the wood's just going to be dead cells as you get into the tree. You can see here, this is an oak tree. You can see here kind of those vessels that are transporting that water up. Just kind of wild. Visual to the eye, you can see on certain trees. Okay, now we'll get into the phloem. So this is a tiny little layer. So you got to look hard on this. You like to think that, you have this big, thick xylem getting bigger and bigger every year. It is the wood of the trees. Well, the phloem is on the other side of the cambium. So the cambium is producing wood on the inside, the xylem, and phloem, or xylem on the inside and phloem on the outside. So phloem is just a few layers thick. And the purpose of that is it transports the sugars. This is vitally important for that tree. So as those leaves are making sugar, it's transporting that throughout the tree to be able to use to grow. So this is a very crucial layer there. It's not very big, but it's transporting those sugars down to the roots at the end of the year for storage. But think about it, when people are tapping trees for maple syrup, they're tapping into the sugars of that tree, which is being transported in the phloem. So if you've ever seen a tree being tapped, those taps are not that big. It doesn't go that far into the tree. They just really need to get it in to the phloem for transporting those sugars, or for capturing some of those sugars. So very, very important. It's kind of right at the surface though. Every year they adds more phloem, and the old phloem just kind of gets crushed into the bark. So it's adding new phloem every single year. But because it's right at that surface, it's right under the bark, that's why things, like emerald ash borer are so devastating to ash trees, or anything that's going to dig those canals. So an emerald ash borer will kind of lay its larvae in the tree, and the larvae are what the problem is. They eat the phloem, essentially, the cambium layer. So they're feeding on that to become adults, to grow. And what they're doing is they dig these canals, which ultimately starves the tree because it can't transport the sugars up and down. So they can't get it down to the roots from where they have it. So eventually it's a slow death. So the last thing on that secondary growth is what I was saying, the compartmentalization. This is what makes a tree a tree. So a lot of that xylem is that dead wood, but if you cut yourself, eventually your body's going to heal. It's going to heal that, make new skin. Well, trees can't do that. they're not healing their cells. They're not putting on new layers like that, but they can compartmentalize things. And the reason I'm going into this is, this will also help with understanding why we prune, where we prune trees. Even getting a tree ready to get in the ground is getting rid of some branches that might be needed. But trees, they actually compartmentalize wounds. So branches are always breaking off. Branches that can't get enough sunlight eventually die, and they break off. But trees actually will compartmentalize that wound so it doesn't become a problem within that tree. They do their best to do that. And you can see that. So this was a branch at one time. Eventually, new wood, new xylem, new phloem through that cambium grew over this. Okay, there's still dead cells within there, but there's new wood going over top. It's kind of protecting that tree. And you can see this part right here. There was a huge wound on the picture on the right, big wound there. And you can see kind of the tree closing that wound, or at least, growing new wood over top. And every year it's going to get closer and closer until, you may not even notice it. And so a tree will compartmentalize those injuries. So this is a great example. This is an oak tree. You can tell by the star-shaped pith, but you can see there was an injury to that tree. And if you can count the rings, it might have been, 10 years ago or so. And so what a tree will do is grow that new wood over top of that to kind of slow down that decay. But you can see the rays right there. So there's added protection to stop the decay going into the tree through those rings, out of the tree through the new wood. And then those rays are compartmentalizing things to the right and the left. And then the trees can also plug some of their vessels to prevent decay from going. So trees do a really good job on that. It's a temporary thing. It's kind of slows down the decay, but trees are always getting injured. So they're pretty remarkable. Okay, so just to recap on that, just what you kind of really should know. You don't need all that information, but lateral growth is trees compartmentalize injury. Vascular cambium produces xylem on the inside, phloem on the outside. Xylem transports water, and it also stores carbohydrates, and is the support system for that tree. Phloem transports the sugars throughout the tree. So all you really kind of need to know where they are, how it works on a tree, and how you kind of want to protect them. Bark, I'm not going to get too much into bark, but bark is pretty awesome. You can imagine what bark's doing for the tree. It's kind of that thermal regulator for the tree. So it keeps in the summertime, the phloem and the cambium are right under that bark. So it's susceptible to drying out. It's susceptible to overheating. It's susceptible to extreme cold. What the bark does, it protects those layers. It's kind of like that, a coat that you might be wearing that keep you cool or keep you warm. It's produced in a cambium layer. The only thing I'll go into with bark is it's pretty wild that all bark on the trees when the tree is young is nice and smooth. So you see the picture on the right, it's a young tree. You can see those lenticels where the gas exchange is happening. As that tree gets older, that tree on the left is the same species. That's both black cherry. So as that tree is growing, the bark can't grow to keep up with how fast that tree is growing. So what happens are fractures and fissures start to break in the bark, which is totally natural. It's totally a good thing. But it's kind of cool that the fibers that hold the bark to the tree are in different shapes depending on the species. And that's why, a black cherry's bark is going to look so much different than a white oak. There's just different types of bark, the fibers that are holding them on and how that tree is growing. It's kind of wild. You can start IDing trees by just their bark. All right, leaves. So that's obviously, you guys know what leaves do. They're green, they got chlorophyll. They're actually producing the sugars right now. So they merge in the spring. For conifers, they're there year round. And any nice day that you have where there's enough water in the ground, we had really mild winter. Conifers took advantage of that. We're able to still produce food for the tree. It's when it gets really cold and water becomes unavailable, it's not going to make this food. So, deciduous trees, those angiosperms, are going to put them out just in the spring, drop them in the fall, but they're producing the food. So right now trying to make as much food as possible to kind of get through midsummer to get that growth going. And then they're going to start making extra food to start sending down to the roots for storage. And that'll be later in the summer in through fall to make sure they have enough that way. So they're growing and making food now for use and storage. Cool thing about leaves, how they do it, it's through photosynthesis. They're making those sugars through water and carbon dioxide. But how they transport it is they have little pores in the bottom of the leaves called stomata. And these stomata open and close depending on those environmental triggers. So when they open up, they're releasing water vapor, they release oxygen, they can release carbon dioxide, they release gases. But when they do that, it actually will suck the water in from the roots. So it's kind of that capillary action opening up. And that's how water is transported, and minerals are transported up a tree, is through the opening and closings of these stomata. Now the stomata kind of gauge what it's like outside. And I'll tell you what, man, we haven't had rain in such a long time. So you're not going to see the stomata really opening a lot if there's no water in the ground. So when it's really, really, really dry, these stomata stay closed because they don't want the leaves to lose their water. Because if they're opening and they're not able to transport water up, and then, the trees can dry out. So usually at night they're closed because there's no photosynthesis happening. In the daytime, they'll open. But they're really cool cell. They're little openings in the bottom, very microscopic. You can't see them with your naked eye. And so the next thing, the trees are making food through photosynthesis, but something that a lot of people don't think about is they're also respiring like us. When we eat our food, to get our energy to grow, that's what trees have to do. Or any plant has to do. So they're making their food, their sugars, but then they need to break it down in order to grow. And then just like us, when they do that, they're releasing water and carbon dioxide. Okay, they're breaking down the sugars, using oxygen to do it, and they're releasing carbon dioxide and water vapor. So they have to do the same. The roots. Okay, we're getting through this tree now. So if you look at the picture on the left, for years, we were led to believe, I don't know if it was just romantic or what, we're led to believe the root system of a tree just extends deep into the earth to grow. It's a lovely thought. I like thinking that way, but you can see many art diagrams, it's as far down into the earth as the branches are in the sky. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth. Most of the roots in a tree are going to be within your top 3 feet of soil. Okay, so they're going to grow more laterally. Now they can put down sinker roots as needed, maybe to access more water, potential minerals, but most of your roots are going to be growing laterally, and they're going to be much wider than the crown of the tree eventually. They're out there searching for that water, for those minerals to grow in. So that top 3 feet of soil is crucial. So most roots look like the roots growing on the tree on the right of that diagram. So what the function of those roots? Well, many, many different functions as well. It's like that xylem. Their function, they anchor that tree in. So that's why they're growing laterally out there. There's lots of roots. Those big roots that you see are anchoring that tree into the ground. Some trees have, bigger roots that go a little bit deeper, like an oak will have deeper roots, and they're anchored in there well, compared to maybe like a tulip poplar, which has very shallow roots. And so tulip poplars, you see getting knocked over a lot more often than an oak, but it grows much faster too. The next thing they do is store the carbohydrates. So they're storing those sugars, in that winter time. That's why in the spring, people are tapping maple trees or any other trees for their carbohydrates, because it's coming out of the roots up to the buds in the day, and then it drops back down to the roots. So it's crucial for storing sugars. They absorb water. So this is how water is getting into those trees. And it's not the big fat roots that are pulling those in. It's these fine hair-like roots that are growing on the fatter roots. They're absorbing that water, and that it's not just the water that they want, it's the minerals in that soil. They want it in solution. So they're drawing it into the tree in a solution. Just something about roots that a lot of people don't think about, especially in urban environments, is, roots need water and air for optimal growth, so they need both oxygen for growth, and they're releasing carbon dioxide as they grow. They need those things, they only, a lot of times our trees, people feel compelled to water them, which is essential, but a lot of times our trees get overwatered. What we want our trees to do, our roots, are to go out into the soil. That's probably the most important thing a tree can do once you have planted, is establish its root system first. So you want it spreading out into the landscape. It's got to pull in that water. It's got to get anchored. It's got to, draw in those minerals. So it's a really important thing. Sometimes we overwater them, and then the roots don't develop. They don't go out into that landscape in the top 3 feet of soil. If you take a look at the diagram right here, so you'll hear a taproot. All trees are going to produce a taproot when they're first planted. And a taproot is just that big root that goes right in the ground, and it provides that anchorage, access to that water, but it doesn't keep growing down into the ground. It doesn't keep getting deeper and deeper. That most of the time it's girdled, it dies off, and then these lateral roots, are really taking over. And you can see this acorn there on the bottom. When it hits the ground, this is a white oak acorn, it's immediately going to put out that taproot, which is called a radical. I mean, sometimes they'll be in the tree and they'll start to put out a root system. It'll drop in and see what it's doing. It's putting that stem up, but that radical is going down into the soil right there. So it's kind of cool to see that in the autumn. You can see that from white oaks, because they're going to drop immediately and start putting out that radical to get down into the soil to anchor that new tree. But thinking about that, so that, just like I said, the stems, they have that primary growth. I mentioned the roots have that primary growth as well. It's the same thing. They're going to do it at the apical meristem. That's just right at the end. They're going to put those roots out. They're going to keep pushing out into that soil. So same thing. It's growing just at that tips. And then you have your secondary growth, which is adding the girth to those root systems. Kind of the same thing. And then you can see those root hairs. So that's where the water is actually coming in. It's being observed. There's a couple of things that's been studied for a while, but it's really phenomenal for tree growth, is what we're recognizing, is a relationship that almost every tree that you see growing in Delaware has. Every species of trees have a certain relationship with a mycorrhizae fungus. That's, it's grown with for thousands of years. This certain fungus that attaches itself to the roots. And if you think about fungus, you're like, I don't want that on my tree. Fungus does kill a lot of trees, but not mycorrhizal fungi. They have a symbiotic relationship with the tree. So they attach themselves to those roots, those fine roots of a tree. And what that does for the tree is it increases the surface area of the roots. So a tree then is able to take in more water and more minerals, which is a benefit to that tree. So it helps them absorb more of those things. And since it's symbiotic, well, the fungus benefits because the tree is feeding it. It's feeding it the sugars that it needs. That's being transported back down to the roots. So both of these benefit. And actually the trees will go better and the fungus grows better because of this relationship. So, a lot of times, that could be missing from the soil, or it takes a while for those to be established again. So, there's definitely a lot of research and studies about inoculating soils with various fungus, depending on where you're planting your trees. Okay. All right, we're rolling here. I'm getting close to the end. I'm going to switch gears and talk about the soil here for the last couple slides here, and then we'll kind of open it up to any questions. Soil is really where your trees are growing. It's that relationship between your trees and your soil. The soil is vitally important on there. So the optimal soil for growing a tree. So if you think about your forest soils, your great soils, is made up of various things. So about 45% of it is the minerals. So that's the broken up bedrock that's been accumulating for millions of years. Only 45% of your soil is that mineral. 5% on a really good soil is organic material. So that's just broken down leaves and trees and fungus and animals that are part of that soil. The other 50% in an optimal soil is just pore space. It's just space. To think about it. That's crazy to think about. Half of it is just a space, but it is. But that's how water actually is transported, after it rains. It just doesn't sit on the surface. It's transported through the soil to get to groundwater. But a good soil will have about 25% macropores and about 25% micropores. And that's essential for holding water in the micropores. And in the macropores, it's holding oxygen. And it's allowing for the transfer of gases too. So like I said, those roots need oxygen in order to grow, and they're getting it from the macropores. They need water in a solution of minerals, and they get that from the micropores. So they're pulling both of those things. And as roots are growing, they're releasing carbon dioxide. They need a place for that carbon dioxide to go and to escape. They don't want it in the soil. So some of it does stay in the soil, but it's released. So you need to have those pore spaces. Now, I've been to Delaware many times. My in-laws are from Delaware, and I know you have various soil types out there. And Sussex seems to be pretty sandy, at least where my in-laws live. It's a pretty sandy soil. So your soil is highly influenced by the size of the minerals on there. So, a soil is made up of sand, silt, and clay. So that's very sized particles of that bedrock that's been broken down for millions of years, for a millennium. But in a soil, you'll have a dominant one. So all soil is going to have clay, it's all going to have silt, and it's all going to have sand. But it's going to have it at different percentages as well. So the reason I say this is next week, we're going to kind of get into picking the right tree to match your soil type. And so it's kind of important to know what your soil type is. So if you have a really sandy soil, which at least my in-laws, they have a really sandy soil, it means water's going through, it has big pore space. So water, when it rains, is being transported out there. So those soils tend to be drier than, let's say, a clay soil. Clay particles are microscopic. You need an electron microscope to actually see a clay particle. There's tiny pore space through there, a lot of micropores in that. So that's why water, it doesn't drain as well through a clay soil compared to a sandy soil. A silt is somewhere in between that, that for drainage purposes. So kind of knowing what type of soil you have. Do you have a clay soil? Do you have a silty loam soil? It kind of lets you know what type of tree will do well on that property. All right, you probably heard this, soil horizon, what the soil is. If you just went out in your backyard and started digging, you just start digging and digging and digging. Eventually, you're going to get to different layers of the soil, okay? And it just makes sense. So on the top, soil, let's see, like, soil scientists will have different things. They'll call the top layer the O layer because it's the organic layer. That's where it makes sense. It's where everything's breaking down. Everything's dying and laying on top. In a forest, it's leaves and branches and twigs. So that's all your organic material that eventually starts to make it down to an A layer. Below that, you have higher mineral content, which is the B layer. And so things are being transported that. Most of your root system is going to be in that B layer. Okay, it's providing that anchorage and it's good minerals down in that area. Once you get down to the sea level, that you're getting into just sort of bedrock type material. So there's not a lot of nutrient, and there's a lot of minerals down there, but there's not a lot of organic material. There's not a lot of good pore space. You don't have organisms. You don't have your funguses down there, your worms, or your things going on there. So now thinking about it, this is why your roots don't go down that deep, okay? Your roots are going to hang out in that B layer. So the top few feet of that soil. And kind of the reason I mention this is a lot of times when you get into more urban, suburban soils, well, we've manipulated those soils, for us to live, new construction sites, new neighborhoods, things like that. So a lot of urban soils, lack an O layer, or an A layer. They just never had it. And the B layer might be a little bit thin, or it's manipulated, it's been compacted, that type of thing. So it's really important to know that, you know, it might look good on the surface, your soils, but below them, you have to understand kind of what's going on below that. And when we talk about site assessment, we'll talk about how to determine what's going on under that grass or wherever you are planting, and then how to match the right tree that's going to grow into those areas. So, you know, in those real poor soils, you know, it's best to pick a tree that's going to do really well. In a compacted soil like that, you know, something like a pin oak would do much better than, say, a tulip poplar that needs a nice, moist, loamy soil, you know, or like a hackberry. That's a great tree, but they do really well in poor soil conditions. And a lot of times those urban suburban soils are highly compacted. You know, so, you know, why compaction is not great is think about those pore spaces. That 50% of that soil is supposed to be pore spaces. Well, you know, when we're putting traffic on it, high traffic area, you know, we're losing the pore spaces. The pore spaces get compressed as those minerals go on top of them. So, you know, things don't grow as well. So it's good to match trees that'll do well in those compacted areas. And the last thing I'm going to say about soil is, you know, I get asked this a lot. It's like, oh, should I fertilize it? Do I need to amend the soil if I found out it's not great soil? And I would say no, definitely not. There might be a place for fertilization later in the tree's life, but it's best to kind of match the tree with the soils that you have. Now, one thing, you know, urban and suburban soils tend to have a higher pH. So they tend to be more alkaline than, let's say, a forest soil. Most trees are going to grow in a soil that's between 6.2 and 7.3. So slightly acidic. Anything below 7 is acidic. Anything above 7 is alkaline, those type of soils. Most natural soils are a little bit acidic. Most trees grow best in a slightly acidic soil. So you can adjust some soils, especially soils that are more alkaline. You can bring them down through, you know, sulfur type additives. But why pH, I think, is the most important thing when you're looking at soils is the soil pH affects the availability of the nutrients that your trees need. So those soils are providing micronutrients and macronutrients at various levels. When your soils tend to become too acidic or too alkaline, even though the soils have all the minerals, like you did a soil test and it has all the minerals that the trees need, they may not be available to the tree. The tree can't take them up because they're bound too hard through the alkaline soils. And that's just kind of why I bring that up is, you know, we'll talk about that next week, but you can slightly amend soils for compaction and you can slightly amend soils in pH, but the rest of the stuff is better to match the right tree for those growing conditions than it is to try to put a good tree, then constantly try to fertilize or amend what's in that soil. And that was a lot of information. So I'm going to kind of open it up to questions. The next 3 sessions won't be as dense, but I figured that we hit you all at once and see who the troopers are for the next week. So does anyone have any questions about anything we just covered? And we're going to make this available to you so you can review, you know, any part of it that you want. Jenna, were there any questions?
Nope, just questions about sharing the presentation afterwards, but that's already been answered.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, good.
Everyone's probably still absorbing. Oh, someone did ask, is there a tree manual for the South?
That urban tree manual, that has southern species. Yeah, so that urban tree manual, that part 3, that's good for, it's good for urban trees. And a lot of times in urban trees, within that manual, you're going to notice there's going to be non-native trees. They're not invasive trees. They may not be they're non-native. Some will be from Europe, but they do well in urban settings. You know, we always try to plant native trees to Delaware and Maryland, but yeah, that manual will go through a variety of trees that are pretty common.
Someone else is asking for who to contact with help or for help with a tree inspection.
Delaware Forest Service, I'll turn that one over to you. Keisha or Taryn?
Sorry about that, Craig. I was trying to unmute myself.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead and contact us. I will go ahead and put our email in the chat box, and we will follow up with you and get some more information and come out and do a tree inspection.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see, a bunch of questions coming in. Someone says, lightning hit, will that cause damage to the ring and will the tree survive?
Great question. Great question. Yeah, it really depends on the degree of that lightning strike, but you can go in the forest right now and take a walk in the forest and you can find trees that were hit with lightning. Usually they have like a blowout on the side. In the trees that have enough resources can recover from lightning strikes. It really depends on the degree of damage. What a lot of times will happen though is after a lightning strike, if the damage doesn't seem too bad, the tree could hold on for a few years and slowly start to decline. Or it can manage well. It really depends on the degree of the strike and how much damage was done. But you can see a lot of damage. I mean, fires in the woods too. Trees survive fires as well. Question.
Another question about, do counties regularly inspect public spaces that have multiple trees?
Delaware Forest Service, I'll give that one to you.
That I'm not sure about. I'm not really sure, and Keisha, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but on a county level.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to mention that it depends on the county. And it depends really on the municipality. There's several municipalities in our state that do have urban foresters or municipal arborists that are doing that type of management in their urban forests. So just broadly, the answer would be it depends. But if you have a specific municipality or area, then we might can answer that question a little bit deeper. So.
Thanks, Keisha. Looks like someone was asking about looking for a list of trees based on types of soil, like good versus poor, asking if that exists. And then someone replied to that in the chat. And I don't know if Craig, you have any more to add. They were suggesting that the Northeast Native Plant Primer book has information on types of soils that trees prefer. Yeah,
absolutely. So that urban tree canopy manual that I showed in there has a table in there that lists, I don't know, 50, 60 different trees. And it actually goes through and lists its tolerances. And we'll get into this next week with site assessment and matching the tree for the right place. It'll have a list of everything from, pH to, type of soil to shade to, temperature, everything. It's a really good resource. It'll list a lot that you can decide after your site assessment. And this is what we'll go over next week, is do that a site assessment, figure out what's in that area, and then matching that right tree. So that urban tree canopy manual, watershed manual, number 3, has a really good list. And then I'm going to show you a website next week where it's kind of choose your own adventure type of thing. You put those things into it, those attributes that you're looking for on your site, and it'll show you all the trees that will do well in those site conditions.
Hi there, it's Keisha. I just wanted to chime back in on Lillian's comment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, Lillian mentioned that in Newcastle County, shell pot, very large, completely dead trees very close to homes. One of the things that we get a lot at the Delaware Forest Service is questions about tree ownership. So if you do have, if you know the owner, I guess, or where that tree lies, the property on which it lies, that would be the jurisdiction that you need to follow up with if it's a HOA, common space, or if it is a state on state, like say parks facility, or state parks piece of land, or even a county piece of land. So again, like I said, it does depend. We don't have jurisdiction over county, and as a state, and we don't have jurisdiction even over other state property. So if you do have any questions specifically, I think Taryn did put in the chat an email, and we can certainly help you try to find out some details there, or get you some help and point you in the right direction.
Great. I lost the question. It was about, oh, here it is. Does aerating the soil help trees like it does for grass? Have you heard of liquid aeration?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we'll kind of get into that next week, and then even on the planting part. You can't, like, highly compacted soils, definitely kind of breaking up that compaction, and there's proper ways to do that, is probably one of the best things you can do on highly compacted soils. We'll talk about that too, like adding compost in certain areas can help, loosen soils, building into that, add organic material, stuff like that. Yeah, so definitely ways of breaking up compaction are really beneficial to trees in the root system, because like I said, getting that root system established first is the best thing.
Kind of on a similar vein, someone is commenting that they're starting to see the challenges of planting trees in true urban landscapes with small breaks in the sidewalk. How can we get a good root system for the trees, and how can they find water?
That is a great question. Like true urban trees, and I'll defer that to Delaware Forest Service. But they're essential in urban areas, but they could be short-lived. They're a challenge. It's different than planting them in the rural areas. But doing that site assessment, which we'll talk about next week, is key. Is kind of understanding those things before you put the tree in the ground. Is how are those trees going to access resources? I don't know what Delaware Forest Service, if you had anything to add to that.
I don't know. I think you're right. Taryn, do you have anything?
No, I agree with what you said, Craig.
Cool.
Another question regarding protection from deer. So what's the best protection from deer horns for young trees? How long should it stay on the tree?
That's something we battle with constantly. And so, in my organization, we plant a lot of rural trees. So we're planting tiny trees. We use tree shelter. We use 5-foot tree shelters on every tree that we plant, or most every tree use 5 foot. And we'll keep them on for, to the trees well beyond that 5 feet. The crown is well beyond that. And even after that, you're right, because, it's the herbivory that's the problem. But then with the males, it's that rub. It's rubbing their antlers on the tree, which, if that tree doesn't have thick bark, it could rub that off. So we kind of gauge that, but we could leave those shelters on for years, for 6, 7, 8 years sometimes. For more urban trees, when you're planting that, you can't get shelters on those. We're caging, trees, so just keeping cages around them until that crown gets above where they're going to browse. And then, there's smaller type of shelters. I can't remember what they're called. We just used them on a park planting that we did. So we planted really big trees, but they're kind of these, I can't remember what they're called. They're kind of plastic grid type things that go around the trunk of the trees. And, we'll keep them on for a while until the the bark kind of roughens up, or the tree gets big enough where it's no longer suitable for the buck to rub their.
Thanks, Craig. Another question, someone mentions that they have an ash that looks just like the picture you showed. Should they prune some of the shoots to give one or two a chance or a better chance of surviving?
Oh, yes, that's a good point too. Yeah. So what I would do on that, and really you can do this with any tree that's putting up those shoots. If the stump's cut low to the ground, you want to take the one that's the shoot that's low to the ground, not a shoot that's up on the stump, because eventually that stump's going to rot away and that the higher shoots will actually fall over. So I would take a lower one, and then, you can start selecting it. So it's just like pruning. So I'd let them get a little bit bigger, and then I would just prune all of the other ones that you don't want to grow, and just let that one that's, you think is vigorous and low to the ground to be your tree. So absolutely, it's like you're selecting, you're picking which one you want to succeed. So make sure it's a vigorous one, low to the ground.
The next question is probably more, definitely for Keisha and Taryn. With the continued development all over Kent and Sussex County, is Delaware Forest Service involved in planning?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep up. Planning or planting? Because we're definitely planting. Well, I didn't hear you.
Looks like they typed planning.
Oh, planning. I definitely want to refer people to our Forest Action Plan, which is on our website, to see what our overall goals are for the next 10 years, especially in urban and community forestry. As it relates to planting, our goal is to continue to increase canopy. And we try to work closely with our local municipalities and county and other state agencies. Again, we are not regulatory as a program. We certainly like to have a seat at the table when planning is happening, so that we can help make recommendations and help guide in proper management of our urban forestry resources. But we don't have that regulatory arm in our program to decide, or to stop some of the development, but we certainly do encourage and advocate and make recommendations. And we really rely on people like the folks that are attending tonight to be trained up and able to advocate for what kinds of changes they want to see in their own communities. So I hope that helps answer the question.
The next question is, are the trees that will be planted by the Chesapeake Bay native? I'm not sure if they're referring to by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay or by the Chesapeake Bay as in geographically near the bay. But Craig, I'll hand that to you.
Okay. Can you ask that one more time?
Are the trees that will be planted by the Chesapeake Bay native?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, we try as much to plant, native trees. We pretty much all of our trees that we plant are native. So yeah, we do try to encourage that. But sometimes in, urban areas, sometimes planting non-native trees can be your best option, especially some of the real resilient ones. Can do it, but we at the Alliance usually plant native.
And Craig, we in Delaware, we do the same, especially when it comes to afforestation projects. It is 100% native all the time. And just like Craig said, on the Forest Service side or in the urban community forestry program, when it's in a more community or urban type setting, We definitely, follow the right tree, right place. So if it happens to not be a native tree, it might just be because of the fact that that might be the best tree for that spot. We definitely don't plant invasives, but there might be occasion where we fund planting a non-native.
Great, thanks. One person is asking for examples of what tree shelters look like.
Ooh, good question. I actually will show that. I think it's the next session. No, maybe it's the third session. I'll show you various examples of all shelters you can put, or different types of deer protection out there. But yeah, for sure, I'll definitely show that.
Next one is for a new tree, 6 months in the ground. Is supplemental water essential in a drought like we have now? Root ball was about 24 inches at planting, and the tree was fitted with a diaper.
Oh yeah, those tree diapers. Pretty good. I would say definitely, any tree you get in the ground, watering for the first couple years is essential. But those tree diapers are great as long as that tree is getting water over the root ball, in inch a week or so, depending on the size of the root ball, over that root ball zone. I'd say supplemental watering for any tree in the first couple of years is essential, especially now because of this crazy drought. Before now, normally it was when things started to get drier, but yeah, the first couple years watering is crucial.
Thanks. That was our last question as of right now.
Perfect. Well, awesome. Well, I'd thank everyone for attending on this. And yeah, so next week we're kind of getting into that assessing a site and then matching the proper tree to that site. So pretty exciting, but we'll let you know when this is up. You can review again if you want, and then we'll even share the slides if you just want to sit through me talking the whole time. You can just go to the slides at your own pace. So yeah, it'll be kind of same time on Wednesday, and will be Jen, will be the same link, or is it a new link, or I can't remember.
It should be the same link.
Okay, great. Well, everyone use that same link then. Well, good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on Wednesday.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you, Craig.
Yes.